Hey, Margie here. Unfortunately, we are all in contact with environmental toxins every day that can negatively affect our bones and overall health. The good news is that there are ways that we can reduce our exposure. And that's going to be our topic today. And I'm so excited about our special guest, Lara Adler. And Lara is an environmental health educator and science communicator who teaches health professionals how to better understand the role of environmental chemical exposures in causing or contributing to chronic health conditions. She trains practitioners to become experts in everyday toxic exposures so that they can improve client outcomes. And Lara is my teacher. I've taken several courses with Lara, and I've learned so much. And as I said, the good news is there's a lot of things that we can do. And she shares this in this very informative interview. So lots of great information. Stay tuned. Welcome, Lara. I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast. I love your work. You're my teacher. You've taught me so much. And I think this information is just so important that people understand it in the way, in the empowerment way, that we can use this to empower ourselves and to make good choices instead of being, totally afraid. So there's nobody better than you to bring this to the conversation. So welcome.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy to dig in and talk about, these environmental exposures and what they are and what the concerns are and what we can do about them.
Yeah, so we're going to go into detail a little bit later on about, exactly which ones are disrupting the bones. But I just wanted to let everybody know that this is an issue because when we have, some of these chemicals, there's been research actually showing that they reduce the activity of the osteoblasts, the bone building cells. They increase the activity of the osteoclasts. So this is something that we really do need to pay attention to, even though we would like to just shut our eyes and say, oh, it's just not here. So do you want to sort of share? I love how you talk about the rowboat. That's one of my favorite analogies, when it comes to toxins in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll absolutely share the rowboat story. I think it sometimes can help to kind of start from the very beginning to contextualize this conversation. Some people have some degree of awareness about what we're talking about with environmental exposures, and for other people, this is brand new. So in general, the topic of environmental health is focused on, or at least as it pertains to chemicals, because environmental health is a lot of things. It's access to healthy food, it's access to green spaces, it's all of those other sort of bigger social determinants of health. But what we're talking about here, what my work focuses on, are exposures to substances, chemicals, whether they're synthetic or man-made, in our environment, in our sort of lived everyday experience, that have the potential to impact our health in some form or another. So we're not exclusively talking about things like oil spills or air pollution. Those things are, in fact, environmental toxins, and exposures to toxins that come from those are concerning. But my work is primarily focused on the things that are in our internal environment, not things that are sort of out there, out in the world. So that's like the products that we buy and use every day, the things that we bring into our homes, the skincare, personal care products, household cleaners, their cookware, our food packaging, our drinking water, the furniture that we have in our homes. All of these things have the potential to be sources of exposure to chemicals that over time, right, that's a big part, over time can potentially lead to some negative health consequences. And the conversation that I'm trying to have out in the world is, what are those exposures and how might they affect us, and what can we do about it? What alternate steps can we take to minimize our exposure to these chemicals in our daily lives? So the rowboat analogy or example is a way to kind of think through the idea that small amounts don't matter and that we can just kind of ignore this topic. And that also kind of ties into, body's innate capacity to detoxify, which it does on its own 24/7. It's a great system, but it doesn't always do everything that we need it to. So the rowboat analogy is, you are imagine being in a rowboat rowing down a stream, and you're having a great day and you're just relaxing and, watching the birds and the river's moving slowly and you're enjoying yourself. And you notice that there's a small amount of water that starts to come in through the bottom of the boat. And in the beginning, you don't really worry about it because a small amount of water is not a big deal, right? Doesn't matter. Over time, you start seeing more and more of this water coming into your boat and you're starting to get a little bit concerned. But you're going to continue on your merrily rowing down the stream. And then over time, you see more and more water is coming into the boat to the point where it starts to be scary, anxiety producing. And now the level is so high that you are frantically bailing the boat out, right? You're chucking little bucketfuls of water over the side and all of your efforts are for naught because eventually the boat takes on too much water and it sinks and you drown, right? That is the very unrealistic, but representative example of what can sometimes happen in our bodies when we have these chemicals that are coming into our body. A little bit our bodies can tolerate. It's not a big deal. And our boat does come equipped with a bucket that we can bail it out. That's our detoxification process. We have a bucket. But if the amount that's coming in or the effect of the amount that's coming in overwhelms our body, then that bucket might not be substantial enough, right? Our detoxification process might not be substantial for lots of different reasons. Some chemicals are persistent. They build up in our bodies. They have a very long half-life, which means that it can take years and years for those chemicals to be broken down and excreted naturally, assuming that we're not exposed to more of those same chemicals going on, which compounds it. And so it's just this idea that if in a real life situation you were in a boat and water started coming in from a hole in the bottom, your first intervention would actually be to stop the water from coming into the boat. It would be to plug the hole. That's what you would do. You wouldn't wait for the boat to fill up with water before you start bailing it out. And you certainly wouldn't leave the hole intact while chucking water over the side, right? You would plug the hole. And so the idea here, or the parallel, is that when we're talking about environmental chemicals that we're exposed to, our goal is to plug the hole to the best of our ability. We're never going to plug it 100%, but we can take steps to make the amount of chemicals that are coming into the body as minimal as possible. And so that's our primary objective and intervention, is to lower exposures. We do not necessarily need to focus on the bailing of the boat out, meaning the detox process, because our bodies are pretty much doing that as effectively as possible on their own. Certainly there's some people that could use a little help. There's things that we can all do to help facilitate the size of that bucket. But in general, our primary objective is to plug the hole. So that analogy, I think, is hopefully helpful for people to contextualize, what are we aiming for here? We're aiming to slow what's coming in. And that, I think, is the most important sort of intervention here.
And, I think the knowledge is powerful here because, once we understand what these things are, then we can make the changes and we can do this in a way gradually so that, it's not overwhelming and it's doable and it really can make a big difference for our health. So there's a concept called, a type of chemical, the endocrine disruptors. And do you want to explain that? Because those are a little different than they have some effects on really our whole body.
Yeah, so there are lots of different types of classifications for chemicals, including how they might affect us. They might be a neurotoxin or a reproductive toxin. But there is a classification called endocrine disruption or endocrine disrupting chemicals. And that's based on sort of their mechanism of action, a chemical's capacity to interfere with some aspect of hormone function. Most people, when they think of hormones, are just thinking of like estrogen and testosterone. There are many, many, many other hormones in the body that regulate collectively almost every function of our body, right? So reproduction, fertility, development, our energy, our metabolism, our weight, our mood, aging, bone health, right? There are really very few areas of the body that don't have some hormonal component. And endocrine disrupting chemicals are, again, a group of chemicals. They can either be synthetic or they can be man-made. Heavy metals, which are not, they're natural, they're elements, can be endocrine disrupting. And so these are substances that can interfere with the way that our natural hormones function, operate, are produced, are metabolized, and these chemicals can essentially get into our bodies and tinker with our hormones in ways that are not necessarily in our favor. And the concern with endocrine disrupting chemicals specifically is that because our endocrine system operates with extremely low levels of natural hormones to function, all of the things that we experience, whether it's puberty or menopause or whatever, these are very, very, very small fluctuations in hormones, but they can have these big outsized effects, right? If you've been around teenagers going through puberty, we're witness to those big outsized changes from these small fluctuations in hormones. And so of all of the environmental chemicals that we're exposed to, the endocrine disrupting chemicals specifically, in my opinion, and certainly in the opinion of a lot of the researchers who study in this space, is that these are some of the most concerning because our bodies respond appropriately to very, very, very low levels of hormones. And we are exposed to very low levels of hormones, sometimes at similar sort of frequencies, if we want to use that language. And what that means is that, the background levels of exposures that we're getting to phthalates or bisphenols or PFAS chemicals, these are all specific endocrine disrupting chemicals. They're classes of chemicals, have the potential to contribute to serious chronic illness in ourselves and our offspring. And that's why I think they have gotten, as a class, more attention than non-endocrine disrupting chemicals.
It's interesting when it comes to the bones, there's actually been research that both phthalates and BPA decrease circulating levels of vitamin D, and that can increase the risk of vitamin D deficiency, which has such negative effects on our bones and overall health. They found higher urine levels of phthalates, and people who have higher urine levels of phthalates have lower hip and femur bone density, bone mineral density, and they're at a higher risk for osteoporosis. So they've also found that the BPA, and we'll talk about BPA because that's so interesting, directly suppresses osteoclast and osteoblast development. So it stops the bone turnover. So there's just so many reasons why, besides everything else in our body, that this is affecting our bones, and something that, as you said, we want to take steps to minimize. So where you want to just talk about one more thing I wanted to say, that BPA also has been found to inhibit calcitonin, which the thyroid secretes, and that actually can also be taking calcium out of our bones. So it's there's all sorts of consequences from these small amounts, as you said, of endocrine disruptors can be negatively affecting our bones.
Right.
Yeah. So where do we want to start? Do you want to explain, because everybody knows about BPA, but it's not the whole picture. Do you want to share about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So bisphenol A is one chemical in a family of chemicals referred to as bisphenols, or sometimes just as phenols. And there are a lot of members of this family. And BPA was long used in plastics. It got its start in I think it was developed in the late 1800s and sort of didn't start getting its primary use in consumer products until the 1930s or 40s, when they made their way into plastics. It was originally developed as a pharmaceutical medication to have endocrine altering effects as a synthetic estrogen, in essence. It was not quite strong enough to do the job that it was originally crafted for, so it never made its way into pharmaceuticals for that purpose, but ultimately a couple decades later found its way into plastics, where it has remained to this day. I think it was in the very early 2000s, it was discovered that BPA, which was used in a specific type of plastic called polycarbonate plastic. Polycarbonate plastic is what food processor bowls are made out of. It's that clear plastic that looks mostly like glass, and it's like shatterproof. Like blender carafes and your food processor bowl, the plastic bowl, is an example of what polycarbonate plastic looks like. It's not flexible. You can't squeeze or bend it. It's very rigid. And BPA is actually used to impart some of that rigidity to that plastic. So it is referred to as a plasticizer, meaning it's an ingredient that's added to plastic mixtures to give it some specific quality or property, and in this case, it's rigidity, to make it stiff. And so I think it was around the early 2000s, it was discovered that polycarbonate baby bottles, right, which are great because they're lightweight and your baby can hold them. And if the baby drops the bottle, it won't break, right? So everybody was using polycarbonate plastics. And some researchers figured out that BPA, this chemical, was migrating out of the baby bottles into formula or breast milk or whatever. And that, we already had some evidence that BPA was endocrine disrupting. We'd had that before. And so it was this presence in baby bottles that really got consumers involved and aware of this chemical, because moms were like, absolutely not. Why are you putting this hormone altering chemical in this plastic that's now getting into my baby's milk? And so as a result of that, sort of started this wave of consumer demand for companies to pull BPA out of their products. And they did. Some of them did. And that was great. And so henceforth, we started to see BPA-free labels on all kinds of products, primarily plastic products. What took us a couple of years, I don't know what the exact time frame is, but it took us a couple years to figure out, is that the companies were taking out BPA, bisphenol A, and just replacing it with one of the other chemicals in the same family, a sister chemical. So BPS or BPF were the two most common replacements. And so they could get away with saying that their product was BPA-free, and consumers didn't have any awareness about BPS or BPF, and researchers didn't have very much data on these newer chemicals because they just weren't as studied. And so then that wave of research began, and researchers started to determine that from an endocrine disrupting capacity, these, what are referred to as regrettable substitutions, these replacement chemicals, were found to be just as bad as the chemical that they were replacing, or in some cases worse. And so this is sort of a whack-a-mole situation where we might, either through regulation or through consumer demand, remove a chemical from particular use and simply replace it with something that's the same effectively. And so this is, when people are talking about avoiding BPA, it really should be about avoiding bisphenols. And that requires manufacturers who are utilizing these chemicals in their products to be transparent and to disclose whether or not any bisphenols are being used, not just whether or not the product is BPA-free. Now, in the same vein, there are a lot of companies that produce products, materials, that never had bisphenols in them at all, but are still using BPA-free claims on their packaging. And that is really just a deceptive marketing that's capitalizing on people's somewhat general awareness of what these things are and their concern about these chemicals. So I've seen glass containers, food containers with BPA-free labels. I've seen things like Ziploc sandwich baggie type products labeled as BPA-free. But a sandwich baggie would not have a bisphenol because a bisphenol's role in plastic is to make plastic rigid. And a Ziploc bag is the opposite of rigid. It's very soft and flexible. And so there's a lot of kind of banking on consumers just not being aware enough of what these, where these chemicals are, and that there's more than just one. It's not just BPA that we need to be concerned about. So the marketplace can be really confusing for people as they try to navigate how to lower their exposures.
It's such a good point because most people will see, oh, BPA free, great, I'll grab those. Or that's truly what you said. You really, you hit it when people are thinking, oh, yeah, great, that's BPA free. And so what you're saying is if they're looking at plastics, will it even say right now, do most, can they see that it's BPS or can they see anything else?
No, they can't. And so this is where, the blanket recommendation for avoiding, like BPA is only one chemical, or bisphenols are one group of chemicals that are used in plastic. We also have phthalates. Phthalates are another endocrine disrupting class of chemicals. There's multiple types of phthalates. Some are used in plastics, others are used in fragrance mixtures and personal care products. They are both serving different purposes in both of those types of products. So some plastics contain phthalates, and those are also endocrine disrupting, and they're equally as concerning as bisphenols, but they're found in different types of plastics. So BPA makes plastics rigid and hard, phthalates make plastic soft and flexible. So they're used for different purposes. So rather than feeling like we need to, get a PhD in which plastic molecules do this and which plastic components do that, my sort of broad blanket recommendation is to just minimize plastic use when possible, when in contact with food. And we're not going to get rid of plastic everywhere. My TV casing is plastic. My computer monitor casing is plastic. My pen is made of plastic. My eyeglass frames are made with plastic. So we're not trying to avoid all of these exposures. And frankly, we're not even trying to be concerned about all of these exposures because we just can't. And what we're trying to do is take a more reasonable approach to what can we do and where are there opportunities for me to minimize the amount of plastic that I'm using in contact with food, because that seems to be where it matters the most. So food and liquids, beverages, is minimizing that exposure. And so from there, it kind of doesn't matter if it's a soft plastic or a rigid plastic or how we interact with it. It's really just, does this product, this pasta strainer, this mixing bowl, this black plastic spatula, are there non-plastic alternatives to these things? What are they? And can I buy those instead? And thankfully, there are alternatives to all of these, almost all of these things, right? You don't need a plastic cutting board. You can get a wood cutting board. Like, there's so many opportunities to make these small changes that can lower your overall exposure to plastics across the board.
Okay, so now let's talk about, there's different things we can do. There's certain things that really enhance the absorption of the plastics so there's certain things we can do to actually reduce that in terms of what containers we put in, but what we do, how we heat the food. So I know you have at least 5 things that you've taught me actually that can make a very big difference, that I don't think people realize what, certain things contact plastic and it has more of an effect. So you want to share those?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I'll say this, all plastics are concerning. All plastics leach or release microplastics, which are just microscopic particles of plastic. So that's separate from the phthalates and bisphenol conversation, but related, because those microplastics can still contain phthalates and BPA but we're also just like physically ingesting plastics. So all plastics are concerning from some perspective or another. There are certain behaviors that can increase the amount of leaching or migration of some of these chemicals, and certainly can increase the release of microplastics. So heating plastic, that means putting plastic in the microwave or putting hot food in plastic containers. This is, in my opinion, just something that we want to avoid, again, to the absolute extent that we can. We just do our best, because the heat is going to increase the migration. Additionally, things that are oily, so oily food can actually increase some of that migration, as can acidic food. So the example that I've given for years is tomato sauce, right? Or a hot, pasta sauce, leftovers that you're putting into a plastic Tupperware container. And those are usually hot when they're going into the container. There's usually some oil in the tomato sauce, and their tomatoes are acidic, so there's an acidity there. And if you've ever put a pasta sauce or tomato soup or whatever in a plastic Tupperware container and then washed it and it's stained orange, that's partly because the heat and the oil in the food are kind of breaking down the plastic. So the plastic is sort of the edge of where the plastic stops and where the food starts begins to blur. And what that means is you now have plastic particles in your food, and the lycopene-stained oil molecules from the tomato have now physically embedded themselves into the plastic, which is why those are so difficult to clean, and why they get stained orange over time. So we really, really want to avoid heating foods or putting hot foods into plastics. That's sort of our primary goal. And then I forgot the first part of your question of what were some of the other things.
Oh, I think you said all of them. The oil,
Yes.
the heating. I think.
Oh, and the fourth, but there's actually 5. So the other 2 that I didn't mention are abrasion and time. So abrasion is when you are scrubbing something with a hot sponge or even putting plastics in the dishwasher. Dishwashing detergent is quite abrasive. It's quite caustic. And so ideally you are hand washing plastics that you do have. We all have some plastic in the kitchen. I have a Cuisinart food processor with a plastic bowl because that's how they come. That's the only way that they come. And I have a Vitamix that has an old plastic carafe. And so these are just objects in my kitchen that I don't have a better alternative for a plastic. And so I take care of them differently. That means I don't scrub them really hard. I'm not putting them in the dishwasher to clean them. So I'm minimizing the abrasion, right? The abrasion is literally scrape. If you've ever seen like a new blender versus an old blender, or a new food processor versus an old food processor, the old food processor bowl is cloudy. The plastic is all scratched up. And that's literally just because using the machine abrades the surface. That doesn't mean that we don't use the machine, right? That doesn't mean that we worry about it. So my motto very much is we change the things that we can control and we worry less about the ones that we can't. And a food processor doesn't come in any other material than plastic. So it doesn't help me to get stressed out or anxious over the potential exposure that's happening there. I also like to counter that with the reality that if you're using a food processor, you're making food from at home. And that's a huge benefit for anyone because there is a lot of contamination of food that happens by chemicals like phthalates and bisphenols and many other through food processing and packaging. So if you're eliminating that process by making food at home, even given it getting run through a Cuisinart, it's still going to be less contaminated with these plasticizers than if you bought prepackaged food. So, and I always want to encourage people to make food at home. So even given that exposure, we still do it, right? We still utilize those machines because they help us to cook at home more efficiently. So abrasion is on that list of things that can increase migration, and then time. So, for example, if you have a bottle of water, which I don't encourage people to utilize, because it's wasteful and they'll have contamination issues, primarily with microplastics. The longer that bottle sits, the more of these chemicals are going to migrate out into the water. So time on its own will lead to the migration of these plasticizers out of plastics.
Okay, so one easy thing is to not buy Tupperware. And to
Yes.
buy,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, something that I did many, many years ago is the glass. Doesn't matter. Most of the glass containers do come with a plastic top. What's
Yeah.
your feeling on
Just
that?
don't fill it up all the way. I mean, it's kind of one of those things. I think people, and I understand it, and I certainly used to be this way myself, is that people think they have to do everything perfectly, right? And if we think about it logically, like 75 to 90% of your food in that glass container is touching glass. That's better than 100% of it touching glass. So that's just even better, even if it does touch the lid. If people are concerned, they can cut a piece of parchment and put it on top of the food in between the plastic lid. If the food is hot and oily and acidic, then yeah, maybe I would either do that or just not fill it up all the way so that the food does not actually touch the lid. And that's half of my glass containers have plastic lids. So it's just, again, we're aiming for doing our best given what's available to us in the marketplace. There are some companies that have glass containers with glass lids. IKEA just came out with a bunch that are really great. So it's a glass lid, a glass container with a silicone seal. Those are great. Pyrex used to have a line with a glass lid, but I think they discontinued those. There are some that you can find out there. But we just do our best. So that's one area that you can absolutely work towards minimizing these idea of plastics in the kitchen. Again, like I mentioned, if you've got a pasta strainer, think about how we utilize that. It's not oily. And it's not acidic, but it sure is hot when we're pouring boiling hot water in our pasta through the strainer. If we're thinking about plastic mixing bowls, well, those are getting abraded constantly every time you mix in them, especially if you're using a handheld mixer, right? It's just scraping the sides up. You can see they're all beat up and scratched up on the inside. So both of those, you can get a stainless steel colander. You can get stainless steel mixing bowls. You can get glass mixing bowls. They don't have to be heavy. And so there are really great and inexpensive alternatives to these type of products. One that is, I think in almost everyone's kitchen, certainly used to be in mine for many years, are those black plastic spatulas and spoons, those mixing, the utensils. Usually they sell them in like a caddy, right? So you can get your bowl and it's got like your 8 or 10 black plastic kitchen utensils. People like to use those often because they're using nonstick cookware where they say don't use a metal spatula, use a plastic spatula. The problem with those black plastic spatulas is that they can very frequently be contaminated with toxic chemicals like flame retardant chemicals that should not be present in food contact materials. But black plastic is often made from recycled electronics, which contain flame retardants in the plastic. So that's how they're getting in there. So there's some new research on that came out earlier this year, adding to the volume of data on black plastic in general as being a concern. And the recommendations, from the researchers who are doing this is like, hey, maybe let's just we should be replacing our black plastic utensils with non-plastic. So stainless steel, wood, bamboo, those types of materials. That could just be another way to minimize some of these every single day, chronic day in, day out exposures.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. And it's doable. These things are not that expensive. The mixing bowls and everything talks about in the glass.
And people don't have to feel like they need to throw out everything in their kitchen and start all over. We want these changes that people are making in an effort to minimize their exposure to be accessible. And the concern with these exposures is not a little bit of exposure here, a little bit of exposure there. It's a little bit of exposure every day, constantly, long term. That's where the concern lies. And so if we know that this is a long game, we don't have to ditch everything, all the plastic stuff in our kitchen on day one. We can, if you have plastic wrap that you use, finish the roll, use it. And then when you're done, instead buy something else. And so there's lots of opportunities where we can just do a little bit better than before and do our best over time to lower our exposure.
Hey, Margie here. I have some great news to share. The 2025 More Natural Approaches to Osteoporosis and Bone Health Summit will be live starting January 13th. I've assembled a team of 70 experts across many different specialties to give you the essential keys to improve your bone strength and quality and reduce your risk of fractures, so you can live your life without all the worries and with more vitality than you ever knew was possible. The 3 previous summits I've hosted on this topic changed lives and gave people a path forward. In this summit, there are exercise and cooking demonstrations, the latest research, and so much more. When you sign up, you will get 2 free gifts and immediate access to 3 talks. The summit is free and truly life-changing. So just go to tinyurl.com/strongbones2025 and get started now. Let's go back to the show. A question I get asked all the time, and since I'm one of your disciples, since I've gone to your courses and been really trained in this, I do know some of the answers, but I'd love to hear it from you. In terms of the cookware, people say, oh, my eggs, I don't want them, it just doesn't matter to me. I just don't want the hassle, and I like the nonstick. And, and in the store, they say, oh, the nonstick's fine as long as it doesn't get abraded. So why don't you share a little bit about your feelings on the cookware?
Yeah, so cookware is a tricky one. So nonstick cookware, like coated Teflon. Teflon is a brand name, so not all nonstick coating is made by Teflon, or is Teflon, which is a product made by DuPont. And they are getting out of the PFAS game. So Teflon or nonstick coatings are made with a class of chemicals called PFAS. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So it's a large family. There's approximately 14,000 chemicals in this class. Only a handful are used for cookware. The rest are used in literally millions of different applications through all levels of society. It's in a million places. And exposure is pretty ubiquitous. So CDC biomonitoring data has shown that 99% of people have PFAS in their bodies. These are chemicals that do have a long half-life, which means they do build up in our bodies, and it takes a long time for our bodies to break them down, which is challenging because we are constantly all getting exposed to them, typically faster than we can break them down. So that is a concern. PFAS chemicals have been linked to a wide range of serious chronic health issues, from lowered vaccine response in babies to cardiovascular issues, to fertility issues, to certain cancers. So they are a concern. They've been a hot topic in the research space for the last couple of decades. And they are used in the manufacture of nonstick pans. When nonstick pans are heated, typically when they're overheated, meaning like, oh, I'm going to leave my pan on the stove and get it hot, and then people walk away and go do something else and they forget, right? So it's typically in those scenarios that those pans, when they're overheated, can release PFAS chemicals as gases. If there are scratches on the pan, even microscopic ones that you can't see, we know that PFAS particles, meaning they're like microplastics in essence, particles of these PFAS chemicals are being scraped off into our food, and we are ingesting them. Cookware is not our primary exposure to PFAS. Our primary exposure to PFAS is going to be in things like drinking water, if our drinking water is contaminated, or other consumer products that we may interact with. Products that have stain-resistant sprays. The stain-resistant spray itself typically contains PFAS, as do waterproofing sprays. So if you have a pair of suede boots and you at this checkout, they're upselling you a bottle of this, suede protectant. Those are typically made with PFAS chemicals to make sure that the water beads on the surface. And so those are going to be our primary exposures, are not going to be from cookware. That said, given how widespread our exposure is, my view is that any opportunity that we have to replace a product that is a known exposure source, regardless if it's the primary one or not, with something that is not going to expose us to PFAS, and that change is not a economically prohibitive change, meaning it's not so profoundly expensive that we can't do it. I think we should do it. Right? We should make that change. The other thing that does is it sends the message to the manufacturers of this cookware that we no longer want to support the manufacture or production of this highly toxic chemical, because it's that manufacturing. If we go sort of back upstream to the process, it's the manufacturing of these chemicals that are what are causing the water contamination that is our primary exposure. Right? So these manufacturing plants that are producing this chemistry, and the companies that use this chemistry, say to make a nonstick pan, are releasing PFAS chemistry in their wastewater through their smokestacks, and that is some of our primary exposures. So it is. There's multiple reasons why I think we should move away from nonstick cookware, and so that's sort of one way that we can think about what a change that we can make in our kitchen. The nice thing about, I'll say this, the nice thing about nonstick coated cookware is that it's easy to use. It doesn't require a lot of skill, and I think that the problem. I don't know what decade it was that we stopped incorporating home economics in school. Now, I'm not encouraging, not necessarily saying everybody needs to be a chef, but like some basic cooking skills of how do you feed yourself? And unfortunately, millions of Americans just were not given that education. They just don't know how to cook. And that is a little bit mirrored in people's love and appreciation for nonstick cookware, because it doesn't require you to know how to cook properly. You can overheat your food. Nothing's going to stick. It's easy to clean. And so there's just, there's less skills there. And so I do encourage people to kind of brush up on your cooking skills, because if you're going to switch to something like a stainless steel pan or a cast iron pan, there's a learning curve. And the learning curve requires people to understand how cooking works. So there's a small learning curve. It doesn't have to be large. And certainly not everybody can cook with, for example, cast iron, because it can be really heavy. So carbon steel is a great alternative. It's basically the same as cast iron from a materials standpoint, but it's very thin and lightweight. So if you think of like a traditional wok for cooking Chinese food, that's very thin, paper thin, lightweight, that is carbon steel. And so you can get carbon steel pans and frying pans and things like that are very lightweight for people that might have mobility issues or joint issues and things like that. So stainless steel, cast iron, carbon steel, enameled steel or enameled cast iron are great options. I don't love the new era of ceramic coated cookware that is like everywhere these days. Target, Walmart, everybody sells the ceramic coated, and they sell it as a safer, healthier alternative to nonstick. And it is a type of nonstick. And so there are not, to the best of my knowledge, any health concerns with these ceramic coated pans. They're not made with PFAS chemistry. The problem is the coatings don't last very long. So after 6 months to a year of using it every day, the non-stick ceramic coating is worn off. And then it just becomes an unpleasant, everything sticks to it pan, and people throw them out, and then they have to buy a new set. And they're doing that, every 6 months to every year. And it's just a waste of money. So for that reason, I don't recommend the ceramic coated. But cookware is another place where, when people they've had it with their scratched up nonstick cookware, or it's a holiday and they want to get something new in, to replace some of that nonstick cookware with, again, either stainless steel, cast iron, enameled cast iron, or carbon steel, or glass if it's like a baking dish.
Oh, well, thank you. So we could go on and on, but I do want you, if there's a couple free things, then, yes, we're going to try to change some of these products as we can, but there are free things that everybody can do that can truly, as you say, we're trying to reduce our exposure. You want to share some of those so that people can right away do some of the free things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the challenges in this space is that a lot of people just want to sell you something. And there's a lot of things that we can do that are completely free, that won't cost you a penny, and in some instances can save you money. And I like people to start with these because it's just a good habit. So the first thing that you can do is open your windows regularly. Even if you live in the city, you don't have to be open all day. Even if they're open just for 10 or 15 minutes a day, can really help to improve your indoor air quality. And the reason for this is that, if we think about all the stuff that we bring in, our couch, our carpet, we paint the walls, we have all this furniture, that furniture, the carpeting, the paint, they're all made with chemicals, and including chemicals that can be harmful, and including chemicals that can off gas or migrate out. If people have ever been into like a brand new construction home, it has a really specific smell. That specific smell is off-gassing chemicals from new building materials. And you can still have chemicals off-gas even if you can't smell it. Those chemicals get trapped inside our homes because, as a general rule, homes are built to be very energy efficient. And then people want to keep their heating costs down and their cooling costs down, so they keep the windows closed. Opening the windows allows for fresh air in and allows some of those volatile chemicals to escape. So it's a really simple way to improve your indoor air quality, which is a primary source of environmental exposures. So opening your windows, taking your shoes off when you come inside, especially if you have carpeting, and especially if you have small babies in the house, is really important, because we are tracking in. It's not just like dog poop and stuff like that we're trying to avoid. There are, heavy metals, pesticides, lots of chemicals that we track in through our shoes. They settle in our house dust, and then little babies are crawling around on the floor, so they have much closer access to those chemicals that get stuck in our carpets and in our homes. So just taking your shoes off. If I know a lot of people that are older who have maybe some balance or mobility issues, they still need to wear shoes inside for grip. So that's fine. Just get a pair of indoor shoes, right? Shoes that you only wear inside versus your outside shoes. It's a very simple fix for that. So opening your windows, taking off your shoes. The third would be to stop buying scented candles and those kinds of home fragrances, plug-ins, reed diffusers, sprays like furniture sprays. All of those home fragrance items contain a cocktail of volatile organic compounds, some of which can be harmful. And many of them, I'd say most of them, also contain phthalates, which are those hormone disrupting chemicals. And so again, when you're spraying those in your home, they're just settling in the house dust. In fact, a meta-analysis of house dust studies has found phthalates in 100% of samples taken from all studies, because they're just in so many different materials, and because most people have scented candles, scented laundry products, things like that. And so not buying more of those scented products will save you money in the long run. And we want to just throw those out and get those out of our homes. So that would be, I would say, a big needle mover in terms of improving your indoor air quality. And then I'm like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3. I don't know. We'll see how many I can think of. Another one would be to, when possible and when you're able to, decline cash register receipts. Cash register receipts or thermal paper is printed using bisphenol chemicals as the developer. These are inkless. There's no ink, but they are thermal developed, and the developer is the bisphenol chemical. If you close your eyes and take, a receipt paper in your hands and you rub it between your fingers, it feels kind of powdery. And the reason for that is because it's sprayed with a powder, and the powder is a bisphenol chemical. And we do absorb some through our fingertips. Is the BPA that we get, or BPS, or whatever it is that we get from a cash register receipt on its own an issue? No, but it is part of the sort of totality of our exposure that we're getting from all of these different places. And our goal is to minimize exposure. And is that an absolute necessity that we take that cash register receipt? No. I have seen people, on social media, kind of like holding that like so gingerly, like, oh, I don't want to touch it, it's toxic. I don't think that we should be afraid of these things. We don't need to be afraid of a nonstick pan or afraid of ever touching in a cash register receipt ever again. We just don't want to handle it if we don't need to. And that's it. And so I think, that's a simple action that people can take to just say, hey, no thanks. Or if the store has an option to email the receipt to you, great. If you need to keep the receipt for some reason, okay, fine. But, minimize handling of that receipt, and certainly don't handle the receipt and then start eating food, which a lot of people do when they get into the car after grocery shopping, and then they pull out a snack. A thing that I want to point out in this conversation as we're kind of wrapping up is that the way that a lot of people talk about environmental exposures online, I don't know how chronically online your audience is, I certainly am, is that there's a lot of overhyping and fear-mongering that happens in the toxics conversation. And I don't think that needs to be that way. And in fact, I wish that it wasn't that way, because it's getting people to develop anxiety and panic over these exposures. And my emphasis here is it's not the one-time exposure where you have to take a cash register receipt, or you have to, eat food that came from a can, or that, encountered plastic somewhere along the way. It's just our totality of exposures. So it's referred to as the exposome, which is a field of research that's looking at all exposures that we get collectively rather than individually. And so, yes, collectively, these environmental exposures are a problem. Individually, in isolation, no, they're not a problem. But we want to do our best, considering the totality of our exposures, to, knock back some of those exposures where we can without driving ourselves crazy.
Oh, I love that. And that's what it's doable. You've been working with people for so many years. I've been doing this myself as well. And it really does make a difference. And as you said, it's not, we don't want to cause stress. That's, stress is one of the worst things for our bones and overall health. So that's the last thing we want to do. But I think taking your approach is really just a wonderful way. And you can start free. So I just can't thank you enough. Can you tell everybody where they can get in touch with you? Because Lara has classes. That's how I learned. I've taken several of your classes, and really there's nobody better than Lara, I think.
Oh, thank you.
No, because of your approach. It's not a fear one. It's knowledge. What can we do? So Lara teaches practitioners, and what's beautiful about that is then each practitioner can then share that with their community. And so I think you're just doing such an incredible service in the world. So I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you.
Me so much that I've been able to share. But so share how people learn more about your work and everything.
Yeah, so anybody who wants to learn more about this can come and find me on Instagram. I'm there at Environmental Toxins Nerd is my handle. And then if any practitioners here want to check out some of my courses, they can do so right on my website, which is just my name, laraadler.com. And feel free to, ping me a message through my website if you came from the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Lara. It's always such a pleasure. And I'm so grateful for you to share this information. And I know it will really make a big difference. These little tweaks where they may seem so simple, but when as you said, it's not the daily exposure, it's overall. And just
Yeah.
starting that mindset of not fear, but empowerment. Okay, I can change this. Okay, I can change that. And then all of a sudden you look back and you're really living a very different lifestyle that's so much healthier without the stress. So thank you. Thank you again. It's really great to see you.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Lara as much as I did, and now have some new strategies on ways that you can reduce the toxins in your life. And this is going to make a big difference for your bones and overall health. All the links Lara talked about will be in the show notes. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.